The B-24 Liberator is a four-engine, long-range heavy bomber designed around an unusually efficient airfoil called the Davis wing, a thin, high-aspect-to-ratio shape that trades thickness for lift-to-drag performance at cruising speeds. In plain English, it was built to go farther on the same fuel than almost anything else its size. The airplane's slab-sided fuselage carries a cavernous bomb bay. Its tricycle landing gear and high shoulder-mounted wing make it look awkward on the ground. Its turrets, waist positions, and tail guns bristle from the airframe like the spines of a sea creature. Strip away the wartime myth-making, and the Liberator is a machine for moving explosive mass to a point in space and time, then surviving the trip home. The doctrine it served was daylight precision bombing, big formations flying high and straight through defended skies to drop on industrial nodes, oil, rail yards, ball-bearing plants, marshalling hubs while gunners and escorts tried to hold a protective shell together long enough for the bombardier to say, "Now." From the start, crews learned that the Liberator isn't a character in a legend, it's the sum of physics, training, maintenance, and tactics. The Davis wing delivered range that opened lanes across the Mediterranean and deep into the Reich. The paired bomb bays let the airplane carry heavy tonnage to distant targets and still haul itself back on three engines if one quit. The nose could mount a turret, the belly a ball, the waist staggered guns, the tail a pair of 250-seconds that sent bright threads of tracer into the faces of pursuers. The cockpit sat ahead of the wing, a glass house where pilot and co-pilot felt every gust and flak burst as the airframe flexed around them. Nobody who flew it thought of it as a symbol. They thought of fuel pressure, intercoolers, cowl flaps, supercharger settings, oxygen flow, and the choreography of staying in a box that multiplied your survival odds by the ship on your left and the ship on your right. To casual observers, the B-24 looked ungainly. German fighter pilots had pet names for it and favoured stories about its supposed tendency to ignite, shed parts, and break apart when struck, especially compared with the more compact and famously rugged B-17. Those impressions were not hallucinations. They were rooted in early encounters, in the psychology of air combat, and in the simple fact that the Liberator's wing and fuel system punished mistakes or bad luck. But impressions have a way of becoming verdicts when repeated enough times. The airplane returned, again and again, with bays that could take a city block apart when the toggles dropped, and with guns that, when multiplied across a formation, built a hedgehog of converging fire. The truth of the Liberator lies between those extremes, vulnerable in the wrong posture, murderous in the right one, and decisive when flown as a piece of a larger moving geometry. The viewer who expects myth will be disappointed, and that's the point. What the B-24 actually is a study in trade-offs. Thin wing means speed and range at cruise, but it also means a wing box that dislikes damage. Big rectangular fuselage means space and payload, but it presents a generous target. Tricycle gear means good ground handling and forward visibility on takeoff, but the high wing brings other quirks, like a tendency to weather vane in crosswinds. Every engineering choice writes a line of tactics. Every tactic writes a line of survival math. The Liberator sits exactly in those lines, a tool refined by repetition until crews could feel a formation breathe as one plane. This is why we start calm, with definitions, not fireworks. We're building a vocabulary for what follows. Formation boxes, initial points, opening the bays, time over target windows, escort envelopes, head-on attacks, firing arcs. If you understand those terms, the rest of the story is not legend but mechanism. German. Pilots mocked the Liberator because early experience and cockpit folklore made it easy to mock. They changed their minds not because of any one duel, but because of what a disciplined box did to the sky when the moment came to commit and doors yawned open. The airplane never stopped being a bundle of compromises. What changed was how those compromises were wielded by crews who knew that a straight line at the right second could be more dangerous than any corkscrew a single ship could invent. The remainder of this episode follows the same cadence used for clear thinking in confusing subjects. We'll anchor in dates and decisions, We'll surface popular claims and show why they feel true. Then we'll put numbers and procedures next to them and let the viewer see the whole picture. We will avoid the temptation to turn the Liberator into a superhuman and reject the opposite urge to write it off as flammable scaffolding. The airplane carried bombs to where they needed to go and brought people back who would climb the ladder again tomorrow. That, more than myth or mockery, is the measure of what it actually is. In 1942, Liberator groups began appearing in the European Mediterranean theatre with a job description that sounded simple on paper. Put explosives over decisive nodes and make it repeatable. Early sorties in the Mediterranean taught hard lessons about navigation, weather, and the way flak stitched a sky into invisible fences. In 1943, the airplane's range became a lever. The low-level strike at Ploiești Operation Tidal Wave was a paradoxical use of a high-altitude bomber, chosen because the Liberator could reach the refineries and because surprise at treetop level could, in theory, compensate for the loss of the usual protective geometry. The cost was savage, the damage significant, the learning immediate. Altitude is its own form of armor when your defense depends on cones of fire and mutual support. By late 1943 and early 1944, the pressure moved deeper into Germany as escort ranges grew, and the logic of strategic bombing hardened into a rhythm of weather delays, mass briefings, assembly over beacons, and long straight lines into black puffs and bright needles. Spring and summer 1944 shifted the crosshairs. Transportation targets, bridges, rail yards, junctions fed a coming invasion. Liberator boxes learned to live inside choreographies that included fighter sweeps, diversion raids, and deception measures that tried to force the Luftwaffe to scramble into the wrong place at the wrong time. The Luftwaffe responded with head-on passes and later with heavily armoured attack units that pressed in close, betting that concentrated cannon at short range could punch through any hedgehog of fire. The timeline here is not a list of dates so much as a tightening screw. Each month brought better escort coverage, more practiced gunnery, and a clearer sense of which routes were meat grinders and which, with discipline, could be lived through. By late 1944, oil and rail became the arteries to cut again and again. Liberator groups diverted to anti-submarine patrols knew what range meant over the Atlantic. Now the same reach poured into the industrial map of the Reich. The narrative voice from the German side evolved. The early swagger stories about how easily the Liberator burned, how wing hits folded it, met the reality that massed formations with escorts were not anecdotes but a system. A system need not be invulnerable to be decisive. It must only deliver effects faster than the opponent can repair or replace what is destroyed. The simple timeline from first deployment to deep Reich oil strikes is the story of an airframe growing into its doctrine and of a doctrine learning where the airframe will and won't forgive error. The cadence of a mission fixed itself in muscle memory, wake in the dark, coffee that tastes like burnt aluminum, a briefing board with a red thread arcing across a map and names written next to squadron boxes, fuel loads that balance distance, altitude and the weight of what you're carrying, a climb into air cold enough to numb cheeks even behind oxygen masks, a first sight of contrails that tell you whether the wind shear will shred your box, a turn at the initial point where everything goes quiet inside, not because it is silent but because thinking stops mattering and training speaks. Bays open, doors rattle. The airplane vibrates differently when the belly is a cavity open to the thin, fast air. The timeline is not just dates. It is that sequence repeated and refined, each repetition adding to the grim calculus on both sides. When we compress 3 years into a paragraph, we lose something important, so let's restore it. The mockery and the respect did not switch overnight. German pilots laughing in mess halls about clumsy Liberators had their reasons, ships seen breaking apart, fuel fires that ran along wings like ignited rivers, formations that lost cohesion and became plucked apart. But the calendar moved, and new memories layered over old ones. A head-on attack aborted because escorts fell like hawks, a Sturmgruppe pushing to short range only to be chewed by a dozen converging streams of tracer from ships that did not break ranks, oil targets turning into black pillars that starved squadrons downstream of gasoline, damaged Liberators, somehow staying in the air long enough to cross a coastline and drop into an emergency field. The pressure built not in rhetoric, but in such recollections. So when we say simple timeline, we're not padding the story. We're showing how systems accumulate force. 1940. 2 writes the opening clause. 1943 adds a comma and a shock at Ploiești. Late 1943 and early 1944 stretch a sentence across hundreds of miles of airspace. Summer 1944 pushes hard against transport and fuel lifelines. Late 1944 and early 1945 revisit oil until the Luftwaffe's ability to fly and train withers. By the end of the paragraph, the words, "until its bomb bay opened," mean something concrete, that a mockery built on snapshot impressions could not survive the months when the bays opened on schedule, under escort, inside a box that had learned how to protect itself precisely when it was most vulnerable. Start with the cockpit view, because that's where nicknames and opinions are minted. You close from 12 o'clock high on a large fortress of aluminum whose wing looks thinner than you expect for something that big. The nose is glass. The cockpit is a bright target. The wing root is the hinge on which the whole machine seems to hang. You know from hearsay and from briefings that the Liberator's fuel system can leak when punctured, and that fire loves fuel mist. You and your mates have been told that a long burst from cannon at short range will do more than frighten. It will tear structure and start the kind of burn that spreads with its own logic. You pick your line, hold your nerve through the head-on pass, thumb the trigger, and watch your tracers and explosive rounds walk toward a nose full of crew. If one breaks and burns, you land believing the type itself is brittle. If you live long enough, a story hardens. The B-24 is easier to set ablaze than the smaller, tighter B-17. It comes apart. It lights up like a lantern. Those stories had roots. Early blocks lacked some of the later armor and system protections. Any big bomber that carries gasoline in tanks spread across its broad wings makes a generous target for fragments and cannon shells. The Davis wing achieved its efficiency in part by being thin. A thin structure requires careful design and tolerates less casual punishment. In the first seasons, crews learned the hard way about oxygen fires, about how a hit in the wrong place could propagate, about how a long straight approach without escort invited a head-on pass that fed the worst anecdotes. And of course, human memory is not a ledger, but a selection. Pilots who survived the exhilarating clarity of a successful intercept told their stories with the confidence survival affords. It was easy to mock a shape that looked awkward and to generalize from a handful of savage engagements to an entire type. There was also comparison shopping. The B-17's myth of ruggedness came from very real returns, with noses torn open and tails shredded, images that circulated like trading cards across mess halls. The Liberator did return in similar states of ruin, but its silhouette longer wing, boxier fuselage, did not photograph with the same heroic compactness. What looked like grace in the B-17's thick wing read as fragility in the B-24's thin one. Add to that the Liberator's ground posture, nose high on its tricycle gear, and you have an aircraft whose presence invited commentary before it ever reached the target. Mockery thrives in such environments because mockery is a way to manage fear, to put bravado over the cold knowledge that every intercept is a bet. But even in the period when jeers were loudest, there were counter-memories accumulating fewer stories told over beer because they aren't as fun to tell. A Messerschmitt that pressed too close into a disciplined wedge of overlapping 50 caliber cones and flew through a place in the sky that 13 gunners had been trained to watch. A Focke-Wulf that absorbed hits on the rollout of a head-on pass because the tail gunners timed the lead correctly and stitched the exit arc. A pilot who broke at the wrong moment and found himself between two boxes, a kind of accidental crossfire, created not by any one airplane but by the geometry of many. The Liberator could be cruel to its enemies in those places, and crews learned to create them on purpose near the moment of greatest vulnerability, when the bomb bays opened and every instinct screamed to jink. So yes, the mockery felt true because parts of it were true in certain conditions. The B-24 could burn. It could break in frightening ways if hit just so. It rewarded discipline and punished drift. It forgave less than some types when a wing took a heavy strike, and yet the jeer hides the more interesting reality. Air combat is not a duel between archetypes, but a contest between systems and postures. Put a Liberator out of position, and it is prey. Put it in a box at altitude with escorts overhead, and it turns into a moving thorn bush whose individual spines are ordinary, but whose aggregate is nasty. German pilots who survived long enough to see both faces carried both stories in their heads. The joke stayed in public. The respect often remained private, because respect in war has a way of sounding like pessimism to people who haven't been shot at. What matters for our narrative is not to refute mockery with a chant in the other direction. It is to place it where it belongs. In early conditions, in partial observations, in the psychology of risk. The Liberator that left a field of black smoke over a rail junction and then limped home on 3 engines with one main gear refusing to lock isn't a mythic champion. It's a machine wrung out to the edge of its envelope by people who knew that a straight line at the right second allowed everyone else's straight lines to make sense. The jeer fades in that light because it cannot survive sustained contact with the full system that brings the airplane to that moment. One airplane is a target. A box is a neighborhood. The logic of Liberator survivability and lethality lives in that difference. A typical combat box layers 3 or more echelons of aircraft into a compact moving volume, each ship assigned a position whose purpose is not aesthetic but mathematical, to seal lanes of approach and to multiply defensive arcs while preserving the straight-line stability the bombardier needs in the last seconds before release. When you look at a box from the outside, the guns seem redundant. From the inside, redundancy is the point. Nose guns cover 12 o'clock, but also feed the overlap with the high ship to port. Waist gunners do more than swat at a beam attackers. They fill the diagonal spaces a rolling fighter will trace as it scythes through and away. Tail gunners are not an afterthought. They are the contempt for any predator that believes the attack is over once it passes. Measured without adjectives, a Liberator group on a deep strike carried thousands of pounds of high explosive per ship to altitudes where air is thin enough that the world looks pale. Cruise speed sat in the neighborhood of other heavies. The Davis Wing's economy paid itself back over hours, not minutes, and the payload numbers on shorter legs looked almost indecent for an airplane its size. None of that means invulnerability. It means capacity. Capacity matters because the formation's job is to keep that capacity intact until the initial point and then to hold it steady for a handful of seconds when opening the bays turns each ship into a flying barn door. Those seconds are the hinge on which reputation swings. The reality check begins with posture. The formation tightens near the IP to the point that photographs of the era make even veterans inhale. Wings seem close enough to trade oil stains. That proximity is not bravado. It reduces attack vectors by denying fighters clean lines between ships, forces incoming passes to cross multiple cones of fire, and stabilizes the visual cues pilots use to hold position when flak tries to bounce them apart. The second element is discipline. Every gunner has sectors. Every sector has a mental template of likely lines of approach. The point is not to hose bullets into the sky, but to make the air that an attacker must pass through statistically hostile. A single 50 Wakaliba stream is a thread. A dozen streams, correctly led and staggered across altitude and azimuth, weave a mesh. Fighters are fast and small, but they are not ghosts. They drossings of comms must cross space, and space can be made unwelcoming. Now, overlay escorts. Early in the campaign, the absence or short range of escort fighters left bomber boxes exposed to rehearsed head-on passes. Later, with drop tanks and different types pushing the protective umbrella deeper, interceptors discovered that the perfect approach path on paper rarely survived contact with Mustangs, Lightnings, or Thunderbolts who were themselves hunting for the very lines that doctrine said a defender would choose. Escorts do not eliminate attacks. They warp them, turn sure approaches into hurried ones, and hurried approaches into mistakes. The box's guns collect the mistakes. Finally, consider the physics of the open bay. Doors create drag and buffet. The airplane feels slower, more vulnerable, louder inside as wind claws at open spaces. The pilot's hands want to twitch. The doctrine says don't. A straight platform at the release second is the difference between bombs that walk away from the aim point and bombs that land where they deprive the opponent of fuel, rails, electricity, and time. In those few seconds, the guns matter most because maneuver is rationed. The reality check, then, is not that the Liberator was secretly made of armor or that German pilots hallucinated its fragility. It is that the system built around the airplane positioning, gunnery, escorts, timing turns those vulnerable seconds into baited traps. An attacker who expects panic meets pattern. A formation that should be prey by the logic of a duel becomes dangerous by the logic of a phalanx. Post-strike, the geometry loosens. Battle-damaged ships sag or drift. The box flexes to cover holes. The tally of losses and aborts is never pretty. But the other tally, the one that decides campaigns, counts tons on target and nodes removed from the opponent's network. By that measure, the Liberator box did exactly what reality cares about. It arrived. It opened. It endured long enough, often enough, that jeers made less and less sense to the men who had to fly into those meshes to deliver a burst at close range. They stopped laughing not because they lost their humor, but because a system that works has a way of silencing jokes. This is the reality check we promised. Not romance, not denial. Simply the math of many ordinary pieces, arranged to make a few extraordinary seconds possible. When you understand that, the title's turn mocked until the bomb bay opened, stops being a flourish, and becomes a description of cause and effect. Begin with air flowing over metal. The Davis wing that defines the Liberator looks almost delicate in photographs. A long, narrow blade that seems better suited to a sailplane than a heavy bomber. Its genius is hidden in ratios, a high aspect ratio that lowers induced drag, a thickness distribution that keeps flow attached over a wide range of cruise conditions, a planform that, when matched to the Liberator's fuselage and tail, rings miles from pounds of fuel. In the cockpit, this did not feel like an equation. It felt like options. Options to route around weather instead of ploughing straight through. Options to detour around the worst flak belts. Options to climb a few hundred feet higher than expected and throw off the aim solutions of gunners looking up from rail yards and refineries. That same thinness, however, is a promise with small print. Structure that is optimized for efficiency does not love being bitten by cannon shells. The wing box, ribs, and spars are strong in their designed directions but can suffer dramatically from hits at unfortunate angles that unspool loads in ways the drawing board never intended. Crews learned to live inside that promise. Maintenance crews became surgeons, reading the airplane's needs in the stains it left on the ground. A patch on a leading edge meant one set of checks, a brownish streak from a cowl meant another. A fuel smell that refused to dissipate under a summer sun meant all hands with flashlights in the bays. Fire was the fear that connected all of these. Gasoline atomizes into a mist that looks almost pretty when it catches light until it catches fire. Early Liberators had plumbing that, once compromised, could feed that worst vision. Incrementally, field and factory layered fixes. Self-sealing tanks improved, lines were rerouted or shielded, wiring bundles found better paths, fire-extinguishing procedures were drilled until hands moved without orders. None of that turned the wing into armor. What it did was move the odds. The thin wing's gift range and speed at cruise could be kept in play for the months when the war asked for it most. The rest of the airplane's engineering tells the same story of bargains. The fuselage is a box, which offends the eye that expects curves from aircraft but delights the quartermaster who wants cubic feet. Rectangles pack bombs efficiently, and allow dual bays that can be split for different loads, general purpose in one, incendiaries in the other, clusters for bridges here, for oil tanks there. The tricycle gear, a novelty when the type debuted, looks ungainly, but gives pilots better forward visibility on the roll and lets the nose houses a turret without worrying about prop-you-strike angles. Cooling air to 4 supercharged engines was a daily management task. Cowl flaps were not decorations but knobs that wrote paragraphs of performance on the gauges. Intercoolers whispered their own language. Get them wrong and the engines sulk. Get them right, and the Liberator does what it was advertised to do, carry a useful load far enough to matter. Guns are an engineering choice as much as a tactical one. Every pound bolted into a turret is a pound not available to fuel or bombs. Every amp drawn by motors and heaters is an amp you must generate and route through a system that already supplies radios, navigation, and de-icing. The Liberator's bristles are therefore carefully argued compromises, not bravura. The nose needed teeth against head-on passes. The belly ball with its claustrophobic perch gave a view and a field of fire against belly slashes. The staggered waist positions reduced the chance of gunners colliding elbows at the wrong second. The tail guns wrote the rude final line that told pursuers not to celebrate early. The engineering thread through all of this is that defensive fire is most effective when it is predictable to the crew and unpredictable to the attacker. Predictability for crews comes from robust mounts, dependable feeds, heaters that keep hands from going dumb, intercoms that stay alive, and sights that don't fog. Unpredictability for attackers comes from how these pieces lock into the choreography of a box. Then there is the bay itself, 2 long doors that convert a streamlined fuselage into a cavern, open to thin air. Doors are loads, doors are drag, doors flex and rattle and ask their own maintenance tax. But doors also make the Liberator's name make sense. Engineers could have optimized for a bay that stayed small and neat. They built for one that swallowed a pallet of missions. Bomb racks and intervalometers were not items to be memorized for a systems exam. They were the metronome for the moment when everything mattered. Get the interval wrong and your pattern walks off the marshalling yard. Get it right, and a rail knot becomes useless for days. That, in turn, feeds a feedback loop the engineers could admire. Successful drops shorten missions over time because targets remain suppressed. Fewer sorties carry the same strategic weight, and the airframes accrue fewer hours of risk. The gift-curse narrative is thus not a clever phrase, but the shape of the airplane's life. Every advantage pulls a string that tugs somewhere else. Thin wing gifts range, curses tolerance for damage. Big box fuselage gifts volume, curses drag when the doors hang open. 4 engines gift redundancy, curse maintenance, time and fuel thirst. Tricycle gear gifts ground control, curses aesthetics and hangar fits. When German pilots mocked the Liberator, they were sensing some of those curses. When they later spoke quietly about the difficulty of breaking a determined box precisely at the release second, they were acknowledging the gifts being used exactly as intended. The Davis wing is emblematic in this, delicate only in myth, demanding in reality, and unforgiving to those who confused efficiency with fragility. Everything before the initial point is preface. Assembly, climb, rendezvous with escort, course corrections around weather, fuel calculations revised in pencil on a kneeboard, checklists, chatter, boredom. The run into the IP feels like a hall narrowing around you because the options fall away one by one. You're at altitude. Oxygen hisses. The ship vibrates at a pitch that tells a seasoned pilot the props are in harmony. Up ahead, flak punctuates the sky with ink blots that hang and then pull apart on the wind. The bombardier calls cues in a voice that makes time pass like syrup. The toggler is counting 1 potato, 2 potato, because there are human beings where the equipment meets the moment, and then the pilot makes the small trim changes that settle the ship into a straightness that contradicts survival instinct, and the doors whine and drop, and the aircraft becomes briefly a frame around a hole. This is the second German pilots expected to turn their jeers into statistics. An open bay is a drag bucket. A straight line is an engraved invitation. The lead ship must hold a speed and heading that anchoring planes key off to keep the bomb pattern tight. Everything that protects a bomber in ordinary minutes jinks, little sway turns, a shallow corkscrew to spoil an attacker's aim is rationed to almost nothing now. The Luftwaffe trained to read that rationing and spend their courage in exactly this window. Head-hoon passes were designed for it. Aim for the A-Team's 12s. Cockpit and the wing route. Let cannon do what it does to aluminum and fuel. Brake when closing speed threatens collision, and accept the risk of the tail guns on the way out. Later, armoured attack groups pressed even closer, betting that thick plates and dense staggered cannon fire would outpace any cone of 50Y caliber fire groping for a fast target at short range. But here is where the open bay changed the fight in the other direction. Because everyone in a box knows the doors are open, everyone shifts from a fuzzy sense of duty to an almost ritual clarity. Gunners do not scan the horizon at random. They lean into pre-briefed sectors, memorize lead angles, and talk on the intercom with an economy of words that sounds like a liturgy. Waist left, calls tally high 2 o'clock, nose answers with a correction on aspect, tail marks an egress arc. The point is not chatter, the point is a distributed mind that shrinks surprise. The doors do not merely create vulnerability, they trigger a procedure that pulls the formation tighter, focuses eyes, and sharpens the aim of a dozen streams that, in ordinary minutes, might have been lazy. It also matters that escorts can plan for this exact handful of minutes. Long before the IP, fighter leaders have negotiated with bomber leaders about the timing and geometry of cover. Every squadron knows the place where the temptation to pounce will be highest. The best escort pilots are not simply attached, they are choreographed, arriving at the edge of the formation space at the moment when an attacker coming out of the sun has to commit. When this works, a German pilot diving onto an open bay box discovers that his perfect line has a Mustang growing inside it, and a perfect line with a Mustang inside is no longer perfect. Even when escorts cannot physically block every pass, their presence forces half seconds of hesitation that warp approach geometry and turn an elegant firing solution into a hurried, imperfect one. The box's guns dine on those imperfections. Inside the ships, moments gain texture. The bombardier's world narrows to a sight picture that jitters with the airplane's minute motions. The pilot's fingertips become instruments that feel slip and skid the way a sailor feels a hull's trim. A ball gunner tracks a belly-up attacker rolling out of a head-on pass, timing the moment when the fighter presents its largest silhouette. The toggler counts a beat and then feels the belly lift as thousands of pounds fall away in a single breath, and the ship becomes, astonishingly, lighter and slightly freer even as flak beats the air around it. Somewhere in that second, the jeer dies. Not because a single gunner is heroic or a single pilot is superhuman, but because a system designed around this very second behaves as designed. Attacks still bite. Ships still burn. Doors that opened must close. Mechanisms stick and need coaxing. Hydraulic systems take hits and bleed. Engines cough and fall off the curve of perfect mixture. But the turn in the fight has already happened. The bombs are gone, and their absence adds to the weight the opponent has to carry tomorrow. The refineries hit today will not refuel the training sorties next week. The yard cratered today will not push rolling stock toward a threatened coastline in time. The moment of the open bay is not just vulnerability, it is the conversion of risk carried for hours into effect that lasts for weeks. Look at the title again through this lens, and it sheds melodrama. Until its bomb bay opened is not a flourish, it is an engineering and tactical hinge. It is the place where the Liberator's thin wing, big bay, bristling guns, and the escort's contracted timing come to a point. Mockery cannot follow through that point, because mockery operates on impressions and anecdotes, and the bay writes data onto the map. A derided airplane that drops on aim and lives enough to repeat becomes, in any honest ledger, respected sometimes reluctantly, sometimes only in private, but respected all the same. War in the air is less a duel of aces than a clash of playbooks, and nowhere is that clearer than in the dance between Liberator boxes and the Luftwaffe's intercept regiments. The head-on pass looks suicidal to a viewer raised on chase scenes, but it exists because geometry and armor make it the highest payoff approach. The bomber's forward defenses can be overwhelmed if the attacker arrives on a narrow line with heavy cannon that throw explosive shells into the cockpit, the Norden's sight, the pilot's hands. Closing speeds around a combined 500 or 600 miles per hour mean engagement windows measured in heartbeats. The German pilot must time his dive, judge lead, resist the urge to open fire too early, wasting shells that will fall behind, and brake in a way that avoids collision without presenting his belly too long to return fire. Early in the campaign, before escort envelopes deepened and before boxes tightened near the IP, those head-on passes minted many of the anecdotes that nourished mockery. The counterplay matured. Liberator formations learned to stack altitudes and azimuths to deny clean lanes. Gunners drilled on specific clocker code calls not because slang is cool, but because a machine-precise vocabulary shrinks confusion when seconds matter. Pilots practiced micro-maneuvers that preserved straightness for the bombardier, while dirtying an attacker's aim. Small rudder inputs that placed the cockpit and aircraft's width left of where a cannon stream expected it to be. A breath of throttle that turned a predicted crossing into a near-arm miss. Corkscrew evasions, the dramatic spirals that look good in paintings, were tools of last resort because they traded away bombing accuracy. The art was the opposite. Do as little as possible while doing enough. On the Luftwaffe side, tactics evolved toward mass and armor. Sturmgruppen in armored flag 190 seconds were built to bull through the outer rings of defensive fire and finish bombers at ranges where missing was difficult. Their presence on the intercept roster says much about the state of the air war. When single-ship elegance can't guarantee kills against a coherent box with escorts, you build battering rams and accept the losses as the price for breaking the formation's will. Against such opponents, escort timing mattered even more. PO 47 seconds with drop tanks, and later PO 51 seconds extended the protective canopy, not by hovering over the bombers like shepherds, but by hunting the approaches and turning built-to-plan attacks into opportunistic lunges. Navigation aids and radar added another layer to the chessboard. Vectors that once depended on ground observers and guessing at contrails became crisper as both sides folded electronics into their procedures. Bomber streams could be funneled along corridors that spread out the defenders' options. Defenders could ride bearings toward ingress points with more confidence. The tactics were never static because the air was never empty. Weather cancelled elegance daily. A cloud bank over the target could push an IP to a second option. A crosswind could smear spacing that looked beautiful on a chalkboard. The side that adapted faster on the day often looked smarter than it was. The Liberator's contribution to adaptation was stability under small, precise hands, and a doctrine that told crews what not to do. If all this sounds bloodless, restore the faces. Tactics are made of people who get hungry and tired and scared, and who still remember which switch to hit when the hydraulic pressure pops. The escort envelope is flown by young men looking for specks in a big sky, and then deciding, in seconds, whether those specks are in the right place to be hunted without leaving the bombers naked. The head-on pass is executed by men who discover that the human brain calculates closing speed very poorly when death occupies both ends of the line. The box is held together by pilots who refuse to chase holes when the flak makes space feel like a trampoline. The reason the Liberator earned respect is that its tactics did not rely on heroics. They relied on habits that, when multiplied across dozens of humans, became something like inevitability. No account of the Liberator's reputation is honest without confronting Ploiești, because the images from August 1943 are the ones that made even friends call the airplane fragile. The plan was audacity weaponized. A low-level strike by B-24, 4 groups against oil refineries that fed the Axis war machine, routed over mountains and down valleys to appear over the target at rooftop height, where flak calibration would be wrong, and smoke and shock might add confusion. The choice of the Liberator was not incidental. Range made the mission possible. Payload made it meaningful. But the doctrine for which the airframe was built, high altitude, precision, mutual protection in boxes, was set aside for a single-stroke gamble, that would either cripple refineries or chew up air crews in a space where the advantages of formation disappeared. The paradox is that Ploiești both harmed and burnished the Liberator's reputation. Harmed because the photos of burning, dismembered B-24 seconds threading through smokestacks looked like proof that the airplane couldn't take punishment. Burnished because those same photos record an airframe hauling serious tonnage across hostile geography, surviving treetop-level hazards, wires, towers, terrain, and still delivering bombs that turned oil into black weather. Low level changes the math. The Davis wing's efficiency at cruise does not brace you when a smokestack appears in the windscreen and the world is a blur. Guns that are elegant in overlapping arcs at altitude cannot cover a church tower you didn't see at 250 feet. Mutual support is hard when a single wrong turn breaks a formation into fingers of aircraft, each threading its own labyrinth. Losses were grievous: navigation errors, early flak alarms, and the sheer complexity of the route-scattered packages that had trained to be tight. Yet even in the chaos, the airplane showed the traits that would be decisive a year later at altitude: payload that mattered, range that made the attempt feasible, and crews that could wring performance from a design stretched beyond doctrine. After Ploiești, the Liberator's myth suffered in the popular imagination because the camera loves dramatic wreckage. Inside the community, the lessons learned bled forward: the need to keep doctrine aligned with design, the way surprise is a wasting asset in daylight against prepared defenses, the primacy of timing and route discipline over raw courage. When those lessons were applied to high-altitude raids, the phrase, "until its bomb bay opened," acquired a different flavor, less about trench-level heroics and more about a system making good on its design promises. If you look closely, the paradox resolves rather than persists. Ploiești shows a Liberator robbed of its best friend's altitude, box geometry, escort discipline, and asked to perform anyway. It did, at a cost that consciences still tally. Later, with its friends restored, the same airframe helped cut fuel veins that starved the Luftwaffe's training pipeline. German pilots who first met the Liberator over refineries at rooftop height had every right to mock the wreckage they saw. Many of those same pilots, or the ones who replaced them, met a different Liberator a year later at 20,000 feet under a watchful canopy of fighters and discovered that the open bay was not a cry of helplessness but the closing of a trap. That is not myth. That is a paradox solved by context. Pick one oil constellation on the map, the synthetic fuel plants and refineries that turned coal into the liquid lifeblood of trucks, tanks, and training flights, and follow a Liberator group from briefing to bomb release to see how mockery bent under logistics. The morning starts with a board that has more geometry than poetry. Ingress routes that thread between flak concentrations identified by designation numbers. Timing gates that synchronize with diversionary raids designed to stretch the defender's radar and command bandwidth. Escort handoffs plotted like a baton relay, where any stumble leaves a gap the enemy can sprint through. The Liberator's range is the quiet hero of the page. It lets planners choose lines of approach that aren't simply straight lines toward death, and it gives the formation the ability to ride winds and weather in ways that preserve fuel margins for the inevitable unscripted minutes when the air decides to make a plan look foolish. Taxi is a thudding procession over pierced steel mats that vibrate against tires like coarse sandpaper. Aircrews check cowl flaps, intercooler positions, and fuel transfers with the bored concentration of people who know that drama comes later. Climb-out lays contrails that braid into assembly patterns. Ships shuffle into their assigned niches until the box feels less like airplanes near one another, and more like a single organism whose organs beat at the same rate. The intercom is not chatter but pulse. Waist-right calls a minor buffet. Pilot trims it out. Ball gunner reports the first flecks of flak 1,000 feet low at 2 o'clock. Someone is awake on the ground and impatient. The first escort sweep arrives on time, flashes of wing shapes, quick check-ins on a frequency that crackles with clipped syllables, and then peels away to hunt contrails arching in from the wrong direction. The Liberators keep their slow insistence, using altitude and spacing as a kind of armor you cannot photograph. Approach to the initial point over oil is different from rail yards. The defenders know that oil lost today is sorties lost later. You can feel the readiness in the density of black puffs that bloom in clusters, as if the sky itself has glands that secrete danger. The lead ship calls a tiny course correction measured in wingspans. 1,000 feet to the left is a seam in the flak barrage that the morning's meteorological forecast hinted would appear if the wind veered by a degree. This is not luck or pretense. It is the exercise of an advantage the Liberator's engineering purchased on the ground. The fuel to make small choices at long range, the performance to climb 50 feet above a predicted shell burst envelope without shredding the formation's cohesion, the stamina to be wrong once or twice and still have enough in the tanks to get home. Near the IP, German fighters begin their work in earnest. Some come high out of the sun, trying to push nose-down lines that turn into head-on passes before escorts can intersect. Others try the classic quartering approach that sketches an elegant curve through the bomber's forward arcs, a geometry that looks perfect on the chalkboard and only sometimes survives the churn of a formation that tightens like a fist when the doors yaw open. The radio is no longer bored. It is an economy of calling positions and aspects, short words locked to numbers, because vocabulary is a weapon and confusion wastes time. When an attacker commits too soon, a P-51 unspools into his lane and converts calculation into collision avoidance. When he commits too late, the box eats him with stitched lines that look like sewing across the sky. Then the hinge, doors down. You can't hear it in film, but everyone who rode that belly-open minute remembers the air's new sound, a higher, messy note as wind whips into a space that was sealed moments ago. The bombardier's world compresses to the reticle's crawl across a maze of tanks and pipes and comically small rectangles that are the only things that matter to the war's fuel lines. The toggler grips ritual count. Breathe. Count even as the ship feels suddenly like a loose tooth in a giant's jaw. The lead ship calls steady. The rest obey. It's not courage so much as obedience to the design of survival, which says the pattern must be tight, or the oil field shrugs off the blow. And then the belly lifts, the physical sensation that every heavy bomber crew knows as the instant the ship gets lighter and a little more willing to live, and the bombs leave to invent chaos below. What matters now is not glamour but arithmetic. Oil plants are complex organisms. Damage to coking units and hydrogenation plants takes weeks to repair. Strikes against storage can be patched faster, but still bottleneck output, while people fight fires and pump out contaminated sumps. The Liberator's bomb load is not a number in a manual. It is the translation of fuel backlogs into cancelled sorties. Defenders feel it first as shortages in forward depots. Training units feel it as cuts in flight hours. The fighter pilot who mocked the Liberator a winter ago finds himself rationed to fewer practice intercepts in spring. The mockery dims for reasons that have nothing to do with manners. Respect grows because the consequence grows. The withdrawal is a story of survival rather than triumph. Escorts cannot be everywhere. A damaged engine runs rough. A supercharger sags. A waste gunner sucks oxygen from a leaking hose and pretends the headache is just from the cold. A Liberator falling out of formation is an education for everyone because it shows the shape of the Predator's dream, isolated metal against an enormous sky. Yet the rest of the box does not dissolve to save it, because doctrine says one loss now prevents many later. The system protects the system even when the heart wants to chase. The damaged ship trims, finds a friend in another limper, and the two make their own geometry staggered altitude, offset tracks, a weaving that is almost subconscious. If they make the coastline, the sound of tires on a rough runway is a hymn. Look backward from the debrief and count the pieces that bent mockery out of shape. Range turned the map into choices. Payload turned choices into consequences. Boxes turned hand-wide bravery into math. Escorts turned clean approaches into compromised ones. And the bomb bay, open in a sky black with flak and dotted with specks of enemies, turned all of that setup into converted effect. The oil strikes of 1,944 read like dates, targets, tonnages in a ledger. From the cockpit, they feel like a single sentence with a hard verb in the middle. The Liberator delivered that verb often enough that people who had once laughed in mess halls learned to speak about it with a different grammar. Two columns haunt heavy bomber history, the one that tallies ships and men returned, and the one that tallies the effect delivered. The first is personal, the second is strategic. Both govern reputation. The Liberator's story inhabits the space between them, where survivability is not simply an engineering property, but a behavior that emerges from training, tactics, and decisions made in seconds by tired people. The airplane could be fragile in particular ways. Hits to the wing box or fuel system could catalyze fires or structural failures that punished even small mistakes. Crews knew it. The stereotype grew from real pain. But numbers taken over months show a different contour than anecdotes taken over minutes. The formations that did what the doctrine required tightened where it mattered, trimmed instead of duked when the bay was open, trusted escorts to hunt the lanes rather than marooning them in babysitter orbits, saw a survivability profile that was not the cartoon. Survivability begins with the unglamorous. Fuel management keeps plans elastic. An extra % conserved by disciplined cowl flap use or a cleaner climb schedule buys the altitude change that slides a box out of a planned flak volume. Oxygen discipline mask checks, regulator sanity checks, heater function turns gunners into assets in the minute when freezing fingers and fogged lenses would otherwise make them decorations. Intercom etiquette, learned in the boredom of transit, turns into the difference between a pilot hearing the one call that matters among a dozen that don't. These are not details that make posters, but they are the scaffolding under any claim about toughness. The airplane returns more often when the humans inside it behave as if the engineering deserves to be helped. Mechanically, survivability is also about what the airframe will accept after being damaged. The Liberator's 4 engines are redundancy written as symmetry. Lose one and trim until the airplane feels less like a laundry line and more like a ship again. Lose 2 on the same side and life becomes a bargain with drag and gravity in which clean airframe management feathering, doors shut, unnecessary projections stowed spells the difference between sinking and staying level long enough to find a field with a strip of ground that suggests runway. Pilots became connoisseurs of tiny advantages. 1,000 feet of altitude traded too early for speed might be the 1,000 that would have carried a limping Liz over a ridge. A prop left even a degree out of feather would suck performance out of the day like a leech. Respect from the enemy does not arrive because your airplane is invulnerable. It arrives because your system makes the enemy's job expensive and uncertain. A German pilot who has to abort 2 of 4 planned passes in a week because escorts materialize in precisely the window where a head-on attack pays off, learns a new reluctance that the word respect barely captures. Another who rolls into a tidy diagonal approach and flies through a zipper of converging, 50 Weicheliber threads, without understanding how a dozen ordinary gunners knew where to put them, goes home with a different story than the one that nourished early mockery. Multiply such experiences by months, and the chatter in mess halls changes timbre. It isn't that jokes stop, it's that laughter edges into gallows humor, and gallows humor is a kind of admission that the prey has habits that make hunting less fun. The ledger of loss remains brutal. Liberators did not come home on fairy tales. They came home or didn't based on percentages that planners tortured into forecasts and that crews experienced as dice with too many sides. Some missions collected disasters the weather miscalled. The escorts delayed by something as trivial as a fuel truck at the wrong place. The flak batteries pre-sighted. The winds wrong. The IP a trap. On such days, the airframe's vices seemed to leap from manuals into the sky. Fires that ran along a seam. A wing that failed not gradually but catastrophically. These days birthed the stories that powered mockery because humans remember pain with high E-contrast ink. Any honest account keeps those in view. But an equally honest account sets them beside the long run of missions where the Liberator did exactly what it said on its tin. Carry a lot, far, often enough, under guard, and with gunnery that behaved like a machine more than like a collection of isolated heroes. Crews internalized survivability as a set of sayings that sound banal on the ground and life-preserving aloft. Don't chase the gap is bait, trim is life. Hold straight where straightness is food for the sight. Move only enough to spoil a line, not enough to spoil a pattern. Talk less, say more. Know your sector. Trust that the other man knows his. Those proverbs look like doctrine, but they are also the cognitive armor that kept fear from blossoming into chaos. The Liberator's reputation for being unforgiving became, perversely, a source of discipline. If the airplane will not indulge sloppiness, you become less sloppy. That discipline, once observed from the other cockpit, reads as toughness. Human brains are not good at separating causes at combat speeds. They see a formation that does not crumble and call the airplanes tough. The airplanes are doing their part. The humans are doing the rest. There is a final column in the ledger that almost never makes it onto briefing boards because it cannot be quantified in real time. Strategic tempo. The Liberator helped throttle tempo by removing fuel from the system. Every refinery or synthetic plant disrupted forced the enemy air arm to choose between training and operations, between readiness at the front and the slow, steady building of competence in the rear. Survivability in this sense is not about a single ship's return, but about the type's ability to show up again next week in sufficient numbers to keep turning the spigot off. Respect grows in that environment because the enemy realizes the game is not a single match but a schedule, and that the Liberators seem to have fewer off days than rumor promised. When reputations change, it is tempting to credit a cinematic moment, a duel won, a bridge destroyed, a quote preserved. More often, reputations corrode or harden under industrial pressure. The Liberator's sheer numbers were an argument few pilots could ignore. Consolidated's lines and license production at plants that looked more like cities than factories turned airframes out in volumes that made the sky feel populated by rectangles with Davis wings. You cannot mock what you meet daily without the joke curdling. And by late in the war, German pilots met Liberators, not as rare curiosities, but as weather patterns. Formations moving with a front, missions arriving with a predictability that felt more like climate than like chance. Quantity doesn't erase quality, but it changes the psychology of the encounter. It teaches the hunter that the prey is a fact, not a rumor. Versatility amplified that lesson. The same airframe that pressed into deep Reich oil targets was also the long-range net that strangled U-boats in the Atlantic, hunting with radar and lee lights at hours when submariners believed night kept them safe. The airplane that trundled down European runways with a belly full of general-purpose bombs also ferried cargo and men across the Pacific distances that rearranged maps in pilots' heads. Each role fed the others. Anti-ice submarine crews refined fuel economy profiles that bomber units borrowed for long-weather detours. Bomber crews shared gunnery doctrines that influenced how patrol variants handled surface gun engagements. To opponents, versatility reads like inevitability because it signals that the machine is not a fragile specialty, but a platform. On production floors, the details of that platform were an ecosystem, jigs that ensured interchangeability, training programs that turned farm kids and city kids into mechanics whose hands would recognize a bearings complaint by fingertip alone, supply chains that learned to keep ball turrets fed with parts in a winter when ships carrying spares were priorities behind more glamorous cargo. Riveters and inspectors wrote their own kind of sortie rate in galleys and shop floors, and the Liberator's culture of maintenance made itself felt at the edge of the war when broken things decide whether to keep breaking or begin to behave. In that sense, every B-24 over Germany carried behind it a mile-long tail of people who could not see flak, but who understood that survivability begins where bolts meet torque wrenches. As the campaign wore on, German pilots adjusted their mental models. The early jest framed the Liberator as a big, flammable punching bag that occasionally got lucky when a box's fire converged. Later, the jest felt old because flying into those boxes stopped feeling like punching and more like pushing into a thicket that always had another thorn. Reports up the chain began to sound less like swagger and more like accounting. Ammunition expended per kill, average number of passes required before escorts, arrived to spoil the geometry, the growing scarcity of fuel for training that left new pilots learning attack profiles in briefings rather than in the air. Respect is a survival trait for hunters. It tells them when to break off. That respect, in turn, is the opposite of mockery. The Liberator also benefited from a quieter public relations arc. Photographs of battered ships returning with tails shredded and noses holed began to circulate with captions that made the type look less like a tinderbox and more like a stubborn mule. Airfield folklore tilted as well. Ground crews who hated the airplane for the way its high wing made some jobs awkward, loved it for the parts they could swap quickly, and the access panels that didn't require acrobatics. Pilots who disliked its manners on one engine learned to nurse it anyway, and their stories about the odd landing saved by a last-second gust became part of the lore that displaces the earlier jokes. None of this is glamorous. All of it is decisive. Enmity concentrates the mind. Fighter units that faced Liberators day after day learned that their idealized intercepts collapsed under the friction of real air. Escorts did not vanish on schedule. Flak drifted with wind and made pre-planned approach lines less profitable. Boxes looked sloppy from a distance, and then tightened into hedgehogs near the IP in ways that punished aggressiveness. The qualitative impression that grew out of these frustrations is what we mean by fading jeers. Humor is a strategy for coping with fear, and once fear becomes persistent, humor loses its edge. The Liberator did not become saintly. It remained a compromise with wings, but the industrial scale of its presence, the variety of its uses, and the evolution of the doctrine around it made mockery feel like a relic of a phase the war had outgrown. Strip the story to its bones. The B-24 Liberator is not a myth in either direction. It is not the brittle effigy of early jeers, and it is not the invulnerable superhero of postcards. It is a long-range, high-payload machine whose thin Davis wing turned distance into a weapon, whose boxy fuselage turned space into options, and whose arrays of 50-caliber guns turned training into a hedge against the seconds when doors were open and instinct begged for a jink. German pilots mocked it because early conditions rewarded mockery. Head-on passes against escorts that could not stay, flak zones where formations learned painful lessons about spacing, fuel systems and oxygen lines that punished even a small hit with dramatic consequences. They respected it later because the system around it matured. Escorts arrived where geometry demanded. Boxes learned to tighten where math required. Engineers and maintainers bluntly fixed what could be fixed, and because oil and rail stops on the ground, translated into fewer enemy hours in the air. If you keep the competitor's cadence, this is your final move. Return to the titled promise and cash it out with a measured explanation instead of a flourish. Until its bomb bay opened, names the second when the war's logistics and the airplane's design met on a line the bombardier could see. In that second, straight and true mattered more than clever. Pattern mattered more than panic. The discipline of many mattered more than the nerves of one. The Liberator multiplied to hundreds and then thousands, precisely to make that second recur over and over again, across a map, until repair crews could not keep up, and training officers could not sign off sorties fast enough to replace lost experience. The airplane's reputation pivoted not on a single ace's memoir, but on the relentless ordinariness of converted tonnage. The sober takeaway also keeps the ledger of loss in view. Many crews did not come back. The airplane's design never stopped being demanding. Some days the air and the enemy conspired to make a mockery of all neat doctrine. Those facts are not counters to the argument. They are part of it, because an honest narrative about a machine at war includes its failures and still concludes with what it accomplished. By the criteria that matter targets hit, that starved the opponent of fuel and mobility, missions repeated until the opponent's schedule cracked. A learning curve that bent casualty rates down as doctrine improved, the Liberator earned respect the way real tools do, by work. So end where the channel you admire always lands. Calm, specific, unsentimental. The Liberator was derided for looking ungainly and for how it sometimes died. In formation, under escort, with bays open over the right coordinates, It became exactly what its name says, a platform that delivered liberation through logistics, one pattern at a time. German pilots who mocked it learned to time their jokes for the ground, because in the air the punchline had a way of being written by someone else's intervalometer. The lesson for any viewer tempted by myths is the same one crews learned leaning over maps at dawn. Machines are stories told by trade-offs and habits. Get the habits right, honor the trade-offs, and even a boxy fuselage with a delicate-looking wing can bend a war's supply lines until the laughter thins to silence.